I only talk about Lovecraft and True Detective, but I found that there's a lot here. What I am is furious. I'm a perpetually angry person. This needs to go somewhere. I don't want to blow my brains out or go to prison, so I find a form to serve until it no longer requires my attentions, and then I move on to something else. This was me in songwriting. Rollins. I saw the music and art as heroic creativity, a rage against mediocrity and oppression, with the punks cast as problematic campaigners against the forces of darkness, or in the case of this book, alien horrors and their agents on Earth. Josh O'Connor. In some ways, Lovecraft punk was inevitable. Given Lovecraft's position in popular culture, or perhaps given Cthulhu's position in popular culture with Lovecraft as his +1, it was inevitable that some band somewhere would adopt Lovecraftian themes. It was inevitable that given the longevity of the tabletop role-playing game called Cthulhu, some game designer would bring together punk sensibilities, carefully lifted from cyberpunk, and entwine them with investigations into cosmic horror. And although Lovecraft punk is unconcerned with the superficialities of fashion that for the uninformed represent the whole of punk music and culture, Lovecraft punk nevertheless seems to share some of the do-it-yourself ethos of its musical forebears. But what even is Lovecraft punk? To approach a definition, we'll need to examine a few things. One, we'll need some common territory for definitions of punk. Then we'll take a look at a few of the numerous areas of overlap between punk and Lovecraft found around us in today's popular culture. Next, we'll need to talk about an idea called landscape punk and a place called Hookland. Finally, we'll need to see through what other landscapes the walk from Lovecraft to punk will take us. One author who has written on punk extensively is Greg Graffin, who some might recognize as the lead singer of the punk band Bad Religion. In addition to being a musician, Graffin also holds a PhD in zoology from Cornell. His specialty is evolutionary biology. In his essay, The True Definition of Punk, a Punk Manifesto, Graffin offers several definitions of punk as he outlines his own history as a musician, amplifying his definitions with his own well-informed stances. For Graffin, punk is a visceral human experience, rooted in both rejection and acceptance, individual human nature, and common social development, uniqueness, and communal connections. Tolerance, respect, and an inquisitive mind are core properties of Graffin's punk universe inhabitants. Sex Pistols might beg to differ, of course. But there are many, many definitions of punk. In an essay on punk and Jennifer Egan's novel, A Visit from the Goon Squad, Martin Mullen defines punk's origins in this way. Punk sprang from a disenchantment with the countercultural ideals of the 1960s, which by the late 1970s had grown stale and vacuous. Punk may have begun as a movement that rejected the history-forming mechanisms of conventional culture, but it wasn't able to avoid those mechanisms itself. In his brief review of the history of punk bands, Mullen observes that, by so fervently denying any future, the Sex Pistols were inadvertently creating one, in distancing themselves from a meaningless existence based on the ruinous remnants of hippiedom, and identifying with the transformative powers of the apocalypse instead, they provided a wide open space to void the shackles of the past. The shackles of the past claim us all, however. Mullen goes on to acknowledge that, whereas punk had traditionally been adamant to defame the idols and myths of rock and roll, it has subsequently amassed its own alternative collection of sacred times, places, and people, since it is motivated by nothing if not its criterion of authenticity. Shane Green, author of numerous articles on punk in general and punk music in South America in particular, and self-titled Misanthropologist, writing in Anthropology of the Arts, observes that punk generates its own set of ideologically constructed values that revolve, however ironically, around the very idea of anti-normativity. We haven't lost sight of Lovecraft in all this, however. Lovecraft's commitment to realism, his sense of place, and the burgeoning mythos that pointed to mankind's ultimate fate are each important parallels to punk's culture's sense of itself. Just as there was no future in punk for Lovecraft, there's no future for mankind. We must note how Lovecraft and the Lovecraftian can differ from punk. Lovecraft the man, it's fair to generalize, valued civility and decorum. He was a passionate Anglophile, and in his youth it colored his racial views, though as S.T. Joshi notes, Lovecraft's stance was ameliorated after his return from New York. Lovecraft was solitary, introverted though not crippled by it, and not particularly good at music. Lovecraft was formal, scholarly, and class-conscious. None of this is welcome in punk. Nevertheless, the similarities between Lovecraft and punk are striking. They both offer an intellectual curiosity that rejects the simple answers offered by positive conformist thought. They have at their respective cores the battle of the powerless against the overwhelmingly powerful, and they engage with and confront inhumanity. Instead of broadly embracing popular culture and its easy answers, although Lovecraft did enjoy the work of Charlie Chaplin, both punk and Lovecraft embraced logic and intellectuality, the community of the like-minded, and the importance of uniqueness. They both question norms, too, with Punk's questions about society and Lovecraft's questions about the value of human achievements arising from their awareness of human insignificance in the face of overwhelming power structures. Although Punk, at least in some instances, pushes for social progress and broad change, and although Lovecraft cannot be said to have felt similarly until later in his life, Punk and Lovecraft respectively observe the dehumanizing or reductive effects of modernity. For both Lovecraft and Punk, horrors are out there, and they are found in the confrontation with inhumanity. This confrontation is not a perfect one, of course. Lovecraft has been widely critiqued for his early views on race, while Henry Rollins, punk musician and former leader of the punk band Black Flag, critiques some of those in the punk scene over their constraints on freedom of thought. He recalls that lyrics were often held to a high degree of scrutiny for their political correctness and anti-establishment quotient, lest they be too happy or shiny. In a genre that was supposed to be so do what you want, the thought police were telling you how it was supposed to be. Now that we've established some common ground for Lovecraft and punk, we still need to find the path toward Lovecraft punk itself. To move toward a definition, we have to begin with the term landscape punk, a phrase coined by the author David Southwell as part of his ongoing Hookland project. A psychosphere, a site of cunning men in mysterious places, and a layer of historiography on top of the everyday life of parts of the United Kingdom, Hookland is, above all, an experiment in positioning alternative histories over and within the many layers of a larger historical context. Southwell uses the phrase landscape punk to describe a way of approaching history that incorporates a do-it-yourself ethos, a recognition of the history of the common people as the truly long-term, real history of an era, and a rejection of the mundane and the rational in favor of the mysterious, the poorly understood, and the weird. The inhabitants of Hookland take for granted as real the kinds of events and encounters found in folktales, urban legends, and weird fiction. Far from the sparkly fairy tales and high fantasy, Hookland offers a world where caution must always be exercised, lest an unwanted confrontation with power events. Choosing to engage the powerful in Hookland is not for the weak or the self-doubting. In this context, Southwell defines landscape punk as a different way of approaching the strangeness held in the landscape, hopefully a bit of a landscape punk way that everybody can access without the need for theory, and as his own attempt to explore folklore and its impact on our lives without academic autopsy killing its joy. Southwell created Hookland explicitly for others. He notes Hookland was always about creating this haunted space that anyone could play in. As authors, we often create spaces where we want others to feel they have lived in, but then deny them permission to stay. And as is noted in the introduction to the Jeffrey Thomas short story collection, Punktown, the place houses the stories, but the place is also the story. Here we can turn to writer and co-founder of Influx Press, Gary Budley, for his helpful development of the ideas bridging between punk and landscape punk. He describes his own use of landscape punk as the attitude of the best of punk culture, the things that thrill me about landscape fiction and place writing, and the literary weird fiction and horror I love. Budden draws Southwell's ideas closer to both music and politics through both attention to punk as a stance derived from a particular intellectual, rational, socially conscious position. Landscape punk is the abandoned shopping trolley sinking in the wet marsh of a designated nature reserve. It's the sodden remnants of a Winnie the Pooh toy floating face down in one of London's canals whilst the hungover protagonist watches kingfishers and cormorants. It's politicized, it embraces the weird, the horrific, and the non-realist to try and get to some deeper truths about the insane world we found ourselves. Landscape punk is a method for writing about and dealing with the world we live in, not the one we may want. It's mud and flame. It's nothing pure. It's mixed, as we all should be. This position is filtered through many layers of history in Budden's environment in the United Kingdom. Writing about his youth, he tells us, "I was lucky growing up in the part of Kent that I did, freighted as it is with history. But all of the United Kingdom is like that, choked with ghost and heavy with memory. Stop anywhere, you rest among the remains of lives that passed before. The remains of cultures prior to our own that can be thrilling, but they also stand as a stark reminder to something else, and very friendly to the mind of the punk man. All empires fall." This clear-eyed view of humanity is the foundation of the common ground between punk and Lovecraft, and it is from there that we can now look toward a definition of Lovecraft punk. I offer as a beginning effort that Lovecraft punk is a courageous, open-eyed, intellectually engaged blend of the cosmically weird with gritty resistance to monoculture, to cookie-cutter conformism, and to repression. Lovecraft punk blends an awareness of the horrors lurking in the cosmos with punk resistance to power. Lovecraft supplies the overwhelming odds, and punk takes those odds in humanity's favor. So what other genres and locales offer Lovecraft punk? It should come as no surprise that Lovecraft punk is a setting in tabletop role-playing games. As part of a genre that is forever stretching its boundaries, tabletop role-playing games games are known for new developments and crossing settings and systems, and here we find some worthy examples. Built on the Cthulhu Dark and Gumshoe game systems, the two scenarios published in No Future, entitled The Five Techniques and Career Opportunities, blend elements of the United Kingdom in the 1980s and 1970s, respectively, with weird events. In The Five Techniques, the surviving members of a punk band go to Northern Ireland to attend the wake of their deceased bandmate. They meet the IRA, the British Army, and police officers. They hear that a family has been murdered in a farm nearby. They have a series of vivid dreams reflecting the torture used by the British. Seeing spirals everywhere and following a trail of clues, the player characters find a subterranean chamber beneath an ancient fort. The buried queen waits for them there. That's when things get exciting. The punk themes in The Five Techniques range from anti-establishment conflicts between the British, the provisional IRA, the locals, and the player characters, to fish-out-of-water experiences as the band members in full punk regalia go through intensely conservative Northern Ireland. The themes in the other scenario, career opportunities, are similar. The player characters are bandmates and have a gig with four other bands at a site in North London. The scenario has as its epigram a quote from the Clash song of the same name. I hate the Army and I hate the RAF. I don't want to go fighting in the tropical heat. I hate the civil service rules. I won't open letterbox for you. A glimpse of what's in store for the player characters comes from a sidebar in this scenario. The trouble with young people today is they want the wrong things. We fought 2 wars for the right things. A neat front garden, a brown Austin Max, a steady job at the building society, savings in the building society, a modest retirement, cardigans, pruning shears, ironing boards, the right things. But they won't have it. There must be more, they say. It's the 70s, shut up about the war. Turning to trashy music, dressed like trash, safety pins, torn clothes, nihilism, transcendence, foreign religion, the Buddha, the Pope, the Hare Krishna. Don't they know what made Britain great? Work, that's what. Knowing your place, being normal. What if there was a way to make them want the right things? This simple yet chilling statement by a non-player character known as the Doctor sums up everything the punk opposed: the suppression of the individual, conformism for conformism's sake, servants to one's betters, religion without consideration, and cookie-cutter middle-class existence. It's an existence that lacks intellectual inquiry and rigor, that doesn't question norms and mores, and that accepts the status quo without blinking. It's the battle for which punk girds itself. Another tabletop role-playing game that crosses over between punk and Lovecraft is GURPS Cthulhu Punk, published in 1995 by the seemingly ever-present Steve Jackson Games. In the introduction to the game, the authors observed that both the Great Depression and the fictional near future of the cyberpunk genre had multiple things in common: a recent explosion of technology, the rapid expansion of cutthroat industrial corporations, a downtrodden repressed majority, an active, flamboyant crime underground, ever-increasing urbanization, and the growth of repressive totalitarian regimes. They also described the cyberpunk hero in terms that very much reflect both a punk sensibility and a Lovecraftian aesthetic. This figure is a mysterious loner taking a stand against more powerful enemies. Emphasizing the punk aspects, the game designers note that both cyberpunk and the mythos deal with alienation. The heroes of both sorts of story are usually cut off emotionally, socially, or both from mainstream society. In their isolation, they become ideal victims for implacable forces that want to corrupt them and use them for their own ends. They fight back, sometimes winning a brief respite of personal salvation, although in a larger context, the battle remains unwinnable. In GURPS Cthulhu Punk, this alienation leads to inhumanity. The psychic state of the player characters degrades the adventure with their intensely personal experiences parallel with punk. Here, punk becomes a coping mechanism. Insanity is simply another response, and both are used as responses to inhumanity. These punks on the fringe of society are much like Lovecraft's humans, dancing along the fringe of cosmic powers who dwarf mankind. In GURPS Cthulhu Punk, much as in real life, the punks are the ones who still care. Lovecraft Punk asks us to look at the world through different eyes. If we are to do battle against inhumanity, we'll need to understand the opponent better than we do now. One last quote from Gary Bunner reminds us not to lose sight of the past as we guard ourselves. I've always had the very real feeling that I am part of continuity, that I am in so many ways a product of my environment and the history of the places that form me. And in turn, I want part of what will go on to influence the lives of future generations in ways I cannot possibly yet imagine. So when I heard Men Untold 20 years ago, it became linked to the landscapes that I already knew, the remains and ruins of all those past cultures, and put me on the path that I'm still on today. As the song says, it's a different way to see. Thank you.